Can you hear us? All right. Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone, I guess, to the last session of the conference. I see some very passionate folks who've decided to stick through till noon today before we head out to enjoy the beautiful Rome weather. But thank you all for being here. And by way of introduction, I am Nitin Mahadev. I'm the Global Gene Therapy and Hemophilia Lead at Pfizer. And I'm delighted to be here with my esteemed fellow panelists here to talk about our last session, which is around building the ATMP ecosystem of the future. And I think many of you, like me, over the last 2 days, it's been wonderful to kind of be here with this community and engage ideas and share conversations around how the ATMP ecosystem has evolved. Personally, for me, I think the journey goes back many years ago. You know, I started my career almost 25 years ago in R&D, and one of the first products that I ever worked on was a gene therapy product. And at that time, it felt like it was the stuff of science fiction, really. That's honestly what it felt like. And you fast forward to where we are today in 2024, you know, this is reality, right? We've had gene therapies on the market, and as we look at some of the ATMPs that are set to arrive, it's going to be an explosion of innovation. So I do think it's a wonderful time and era that we are living in, and ultimately, all of this, what inspires this community is what we do for the patient. You saw the patient testimonials today and yesterday. I think it's amazing. I think the commitment and passion that exists within this ATMP rare disease community. That said, at the same time, as we look at kind of the landscape and the environment today here in Europe, we know that there's work ahead of us to be done, right? When we look at kind of the entire, compare Europe to the US, and we look at the number of approvals, right? We've had 26 approvals since 2024 by the EMA with 19 products on the market, relative to, say, 36 in the US. And we also know that even post-regulatory approval, there's been some challenges in terms of reimbursement, market access, and commercial uptake. So there's clearly, while there's progress, there's some challenges as well. Similarly, when we look at clinical development, there has been some challenges because of differences in national requirements and regulations at the same time. And while the clinical trial regulation entered its application in 2022, with the promise of trying to harmonize all this across countries, I think it's suffice to say that there's still work to be done, and we've not yet fully reached that crossroads of hitting that promise, right? And when we look at our clinical trial database and we look at the number of trials that are ongoing for ATMPs, you see that North America, of course, leads the way, followed by Asia Pacific and then Europe. So clearly, I think while Europe historically has been at the forefront of scientific discovery, as the next wave of innovation comes through, the question that I think we all face is, what should we be doing? What should Europe be doing to kind of really advance and build this ecosystem of the future? And what can we collectively, as this community, really start to acknowledge where the gaps are and think about what solutions can be practically put forward to kind of be ready for the next wave of approvals that are going to come, right? And to put that in perspective, right, we've had, if I even take gene therapies as an example, 5 gene therapies that launched between 2017 to 22, 5 alone in 23, and then as you look at 24 and 25, it's going to be double digits and orders of magnitude higher. So clearly, the timing is right for us to have this conversation. And so I'm very excited over the next 50 minutes or so to kind of spend time with my panelists. And by the way, this is the right group to be talking about it. We've got a very diverse experts of panels here, panelists, ranging from patient advocacy organizations, Barbara, to nonprofit innovators, Jim, to developers, Marcello, and to regulators, Ilona. So I think really a comprehensive way of really looking at the ecosystem and starting to shape what good looks like. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to have the panelists introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about their role today, and we'll take it from there. So maybe I'll start with you, Barbara.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I am Barbara D'Alessio. I'm board member of UNIAMO, which is the Italian Federation of Rare Diseases Associations. So in this panel, I represent the point of view of rare disease patients. And I hope to share with you the way we are living this environment about ATMPs.
Thank you, Barbara. Jim?
Yes, so my name is Jim Lund, and I'm the CBDO of something called CCRM Nordic. We are not-for-profit public-private partnership that was just launched in Sweden last year. And I'm also associated to a not-for-profit association called ATMP Sweden that is kind of forming the Swedish ecosystem.
Thank you, Jim. Welcome. Marcello?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Marcello Milano. I'm a member of the Global R&D and Regulatory Policy at BioMarin. And for those who do not know BioMarin, it's a US headquartered company focused on translating genetic discoveries into transformative therapies. And historically, we've been successful at developing and commercializing enzyme replacement therapies. And that has, by the way, created a genuine patient-centered approach to drug development and company culture. And I think slightly more recently, we have embraced the ATMP challenge. We started off by picking up a AAV5-based gene therapy conceived by Professor Nathwani at UCL London and targeting hemophilia A. We've led through the various development stages up until commercialization. So the first gene therapy ever approved for hemophilia A in the EU and the US. And so the reason I guess I'm here is because my company has been able to navigate the current ATMP framework, both in the EU and in the US. And other than the approved gene therapy, we have other AAV-based gene therapies in the pipeline at different development stages. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcello. Ilona?
Good morning, my name is Ilona Reischl, and I am a quality assessor in the clinical trials unit of the Austrian agency. That's my national hat. And on the European level, I've been a long-standing member of the Biologics Working Party, and I'm currently the chair of the Committee for Advanced Therapies.
Well, thank you all for those introductions. So I'm going to start off with a question I'm just going to pose to all of you, right? And on a scale of 1 to 10, right, with 10 being everything works exactly as planned, and 1, of course, being that nothing works as planned. Wearing the hat that you're wearing today, right, where do you see the current ecosystem for you? And then maybe if you could add on a couple of points around why.
This is a challenging question. It's never easy to give scores. I would say 6.5, 7. I can just mention a few things that in our opinion maybe works well, and a few things that may be improved. And I think later we can add other elements in this conversation. So from our perspective, the centralized procedure at the European Medicine Agency level is something that works. Also, the growing interest of pharma companies in developing ATMPs is something good. There are a lot of companies also in this context. And what in our experience, in our opinion, works, it's the early dialogue among stakeholders. There are things that can be improved, of course. Equity is something that is not really still here. It's important that we aspire to have common European, national, and also regional framework where everybody can have access to the advanced therapies without inequalities. There is still too much asymmetry in the access. And also, it's important to change the mindset, because it's important to have enough funds to support the development of the advanced therapies, but these funds should be seen such long-term investment, not just as a cash expenses for 1 year. So this is something that also should be improved. And lastly, evidence generation. In our opinion, it's necessary to have more data and more quality data.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say, 5, but increasing. I mean, there are challenges, that is very much true. But I think you have to also realize that this is still a very immature ecosystem. There's a lot of stuff happening in terms of technology development, in terms of clinical trials progressing, in terms of patients getting involved and getting access, HTA frameworks, etc. So I think it's still we have to give ourselves some slack in this ATMP family also.
Thank you. Marcello and Ilona?
So I feel I'm going to focus on the regulatory policy aspects of Europe. And going to school in Italy, there was something called a 6 of encouragement, right? When you did just enough to, be at the sufficiency level. I want to go slightly above that from a reg policy perspective in Europe, and I would give it a 7. And the reason I'm saying this is that there are clearly challenges, and some of the challenges in Europe, I feel, stem from the number of different pieces of legislation and regulations that we have to comply with, and also from the sheer number of authorities that we're dealing with, right? So if you're in the ATMP space, you're typically dealing with the MA for your development support, but you're also dealing with the national competent authorities for your clinical trials. You have, notified bodies and ethics committees, etc. So that fragmentation is in itself a challenge. But I think what we're good at in Europe is dialogue, making sure that where there are challenges, we can overcome that through multi-stakeholder conversations. And I feel in the end, the EU network is somehow a strength. It's not just a hurdle or a weakness of the EU system. So I think we have to think about that more positively, possibly, than we currently do. And I think I'm encouraged from a regulatory policy perspective by the number of ATMPs that have been approved in Europe as well. Clearly, we were ahead of the US for some time. We've fallen behind of late. But I don't think it's necessarily because of the regulatory environment having become super, super difficult to navigate. It is difficult to navigate, but I don't think that is the main factor why we're seeing that lull in ATMP approvals in Europe at the moment.
Yeah, I'm the last one, so trying to find things that haven't been said. No, I think the first thing is how do you define the ecosystem? And I think it goes beyond what I'm responsible for. But of course, I can only score the area that I'm ultimately involved in. So I would also give it a 7 for the regulatory system. There's clearly space for improvement. There's space for improvement everywhere, not just in the regulatory system. I think that's important to note. I also think, as was already said, the fact that these are multiple member states should be taken as a positive, especially when you're thinking about the kind of global marketing concepts. We have experienced what it's like to have discussions across member states with different mentalities, with different national frameworks. So if you want to look for experience, that's where you need to go, Europe, and not a situation where maybe one agency is responsible for everything. So, yeah, I think we have, and I think what also shouldn't be underestimated, the passion and dedication of the people working in the regulatory agencies to do their best to improve the system, because that is very resource intensive.
Very helpful. By the way, I think I'm hearing consistently across 6 to 7s. And, I think it's more positive, right? I think, there's a lot of noise, right? We use this concept of signal and noise, right? And the noise sometimes dies down or, pushes the signal down. And I think there's a lot of noise. It makes it feel like the system is broken and there's a long way for us to go. But what I'm hearing from you is, there's a lot of things that are working well, and clearly there's room for improvement. So I think that's a good starting point as we think about where to go. And maybe let me double click there and come to you, maybe Marcello, right? As you started to hit on this a little bit in your opening, right? But in BioMarin's own practical experience with this regulatory framework, we started to hit on a couple of pieces, but maybe you could double click a little bit for us on that to see what has worked well in this case and almost use as a way to segue into what do you think from your lens could be done differently?
Yeah, I can kick this off. And so our experience, and maybe I'll focus primarily on the experience we had with our approved gene therapy, just to talk about, how that experience was, what the positives were, maybe some of the shades that can be worked on. And so we, for example, we benefited from the PRIME scheme. So we entered the PRIME scheme in relatively early days of the scheme. And I think we really enjoyed having that early dialogue with the agency, the early support that the agency offered, the early appointment of the rapporteur. That was a key strength for us, being in PRIME. I think it also helped us to kind of hone in on the unmet medical need concept quite significantly, because that's something that you're going to discuss with the agencies a number of times across the development, right? When you enter the PRIME scheme, when you then discuss maybe your orphan designation, when you go for accelerated assessment, when you're discussing conditional marketing authorization. So that really helped us to focus on that significantly, I would say. We ran our trials in the pre-CTR era. So from that point of view, clearly we were, following the previous framework whereby you had to submit separate applications into different member states. And I think the CTR has brought about a positive change in that respect. There are some teething problems yet to be tackled, but certainly I think a positive development overall. We also navigated this, I will say, in the pre-IVDR era, which again has probably added a bit of complexity for ATMP developers in particular. We had a lot of support from the regulators. I think actually that resulted in the therapy being approved in the EU first. Okay, we had a hiccup, I'll be honest, but we reached approval in the EU first and then in the US. So yeah, I don't want to give even more details, but that's some of the positives that we observed.
Thank you. And in fact, Ilona, if you could build on that, you've had the opportunity to kind of see the evolution of the PRIME system across, right? And I would love to maybe, if you can kind of build on kind of from the regulatory lens, some of the mechanisms that have been put in place, particularly like PRIME, and what's been your experience in that space?
Yeah, my takeaway from the PRIME meetings I've participated in is that it's particularly useful to have that first discussion to identify the blind spots, because particularly when you have developers that are maybe not so experienced in taking products to marketing authorization, there might be blind spots, or there might be, putting it bluntly, maybe, clinical overrules quality, and then if it's pointed out to you that, no, you need to address the quality issue, you will not be able to fly just on the basis of clinical. I think it's important to have that feedback early on. And particularly when it comes to maybe companion diagnostic aspects, those sort of regulatory questions are standard questions at the PRIME meetings. So then, you wouldn't immediately get the answer, but it would be pointed out to you that this is an area where you might want to seek scientific advice unless you've already taken care of, unless you're already aware of what is required, of course. So I think it's having that early third party or regulatory look on your development program and get an initial feedback. Yeah. And I mean, more than 40% of the PRIME products are ATMPs, so we get a lot of experience with PRIME. And it'll be interesting in the future to see how that has helped.
Thank you. Jim, coming to you, right, as you think about you play a very unique role from a nonprofit innovator perspective, and there's some very good examples in the Nordic space that you've been working on. Can you maybe share a little bit around some of the challenges that you've experienced there and some of the initiatives that you and your organization are working to fix?
Absolutely, and I can also give you some background there. So to start with, I think this is a very good meeting. It's been excellent a couple of days here in Rome. Nice weather, good food, nice people, very family kind of feeling. So to start, I can put the vision a bit back a couple of years. So a couple of years ago, we were supported by the Swedish Innovation Authority, Vinnova, to look and dig deeper into the Swedish ecosystem. And what we did then was to create a vision that Sweden should be a leader within this area, and that what meant actually to give access to ATMPs to patients and to commercialize. And we gathered authorities, regulators, national regulators. We gathered big pharma, small companies, all the hospital regions with university hospitals around the same table. So we could actually, I think it's quite clear when you talk about ecosystems, there are different nuances to ecosystem. I guess even there are bigger and smaller ecosystems with different perspectives. And it's very important that when you talk about something, you're actually talking about the same thing and the same challenges. And I think that's been a major success for us. And then we dig a bit deeper into the different ecosystems actually and say, so what is the specific issues that you're facing? So what's the problem within the healthcare? I mean, how can we enable clinical trials to be more efficient, patient recruitment, infrastructure, obviously very important there, training of both physicists, but also nurses and people who would help to both perform clinical trial and implement market-approved products. We looked at commercialization, and we could see that there were big gaps in the innovation system for commercialization. So we didn't have any infrastructure. There was a shortage of competent people, and also we didn't see that the investments that the companies would like to see were being made. So that was actually, in the end, why CCRM Nordic was created as a not-for-profit organization to support the early developers and the kind of pathway from the early kind of research activities and onto the patient. And I think it's kind of for us, obviously the patients are very much the North Star, but I think it's important, again, when you're talking about different things, commercialization, I think, is actually the key to getting to the patient. Because yes, you can do a small clinical trial locally and treat 10 patients, and that's good, of course, for those 10 patients. But if you have something with the opportunity to reach tens of thousands of patients, I think then the most responsible thing is actually to go down the commercialization pathway and do things, properly. So I hope that is the kind of movement that we will see much more now in Europe, actually.
Got it. And just double-clicking on that a little bit, Jim, right? I think maybe it was you or Barbara who's this word, this mindset shift that's needed, right? To kind of, as you said, go from a handful to kind of thousands of patients. What just using kind of your example there, what needs to happen to kind of create that mindset shift? And do you see that playing out today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think first of all, you have to talk about that specific question. I mean, you hear it a lot, like in the EU, we regulate, in the US, they innovate. And there you are again. I think you have to be very stringent when you talk about innovation. So what is an innovation? I mean, innovation, and something is not an innovation before it's actually a product that can be sustainable in a market, right? And that when it actually comes to the patient as an approved drug. But some people, they talk about innovation as it could be just an idea. But I think you have to be stringent when you talk about these matters, so you get things, so you're talking about the same things basically.
Yeah, this notion of this entrepreneurial mindset, right? How do you again? It ultimately goes with the patient in mind.
Yes.
No idea is good if it doesn't ultimately reach the hands of the patient. So I think kind of switching this mindset, as you said, to kind of really thinking not just about the science in its early stages, but how do you translate that science into an actual product requires a fundamentally different way of thinking. And it looks like some of that dialogue is what is starting to take shape within kind of this enterprise you're creating.
Yeah, no, so I had the pleasure of seeing Sven Kiele here yesterday talking about the investment landscape, and he had a very good point. I mean, when we talk about science, there's also science and science. I mean, when you commercialize, you should talk about the science behind the actual product, not the science that will produce the next, nice paper in Nature.
By the way, feel free to jump in if anyone wants to add in there, but I did want to kind of come back to you, Barbara, right? So ultimately, we talked about innovation when it starts. Ultimately, the value is only realized when it reaches the patient. And so when you think about kind of your lens as a patient organization, and you think about the expectations and concerns of the patient community, right? Can you talk a little bit? I think you hit that in your opening remarks, but what needs to happen for the patient community to feel like that innovation is kind of going to reach their hands faster?
If our data are correct, we expect that around 60 new advanced therapies are coming by 2030. This means that, me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So this means that possibly 350,000 rare disease patients may benefit from these advanced therapies. So if this is true, the main expectations of rare disease patients is to be cured, is that, a number of conditions which currently are uncurable become curable, but also that these therapies become accessible to everybody who is affected by these diseases, wherever they live and whatever their annual income is. The main concern that we have as patients' representatives, it's about accessibility, of course, because we are perfectly aware that these therapies are very expensive. And so in the worst scenario, maybe we may have new advanced therapy, possibly life-changing therapies that will never come to us because they will never be reimbursed at all. Then alternatively, we may have different scenarios where these therapies may be reimbursed partially. So this means that the system will be obliged to make choices. And it's something we are really worried about because we still have in mind what it happened during the pandemic. I don't know if you remember, but especially in the very beginning, we remember that our hospitals were full of people in really bad conditions. The system did not have the resources, the tools to help everybody. And so the weakness were sacrificed. So we do not want something like this happen again in this area. This is our concern. And accessibility, so as always, something to do, as Jim was saying, with the infrastructure. So we should work a lot on the readiness of the infrastructure, because actually, currently, not all the reference centers are really ready to deliver properly and equally the therapies once they are approved. So the other question was about how can we contribute. I mean, in my opinion, in our opinion, I would focus on two things that maybe are important. First, education, training, awareness raising, because although advanced therapies are potentially life-changing, they can completely change and improve our future. Nevertheless, in our impression is that there is not enough awareness, knowledge about this among politicians, institutions, clinicians, patients themselves. So we absolutely feel that we have the responsibility and also the possibility to contribute in spreading awareness on this, because you know better than me, then advanced therapies needs a different business model, different manufacturing processes, different budgets. Everything is different, and so it's necessary to put in place different policies because they are different from the other therapeutic options and areas, and this is not yet completely, acknowledged by all the key stakeholders. So we may contribute as patients associations in spreading this kind of awareness. Secondly, I think also that we may contribute in generating data, because this is not because I'm saying this, but if you read the results of several surveys conducted by Eurordis at a European level, you will see that the majority of rare disease patients trust more the patients associations than the companies or the research institutions when they are asked to share data on their health. So we may help researchers, also companies, in gathering data from patients with patients-reported outcomes, patients-reported experiences in a scientific and a methodic way. And so we can contribute through early dialogue with pharma industries, also with clinical centers, in better identifying the clinical endpoint on the trials. So we can, be helpful in create more robust and complete dossiers. And also maybe in better understanding how many patients, may possibly benefit from this kind of therapies. So I think so.
Thank you. And I think that the points really resonate, right? Education, and again, this is a rapidly changing landscape, and I think need to continuously be on top in educating and generating awareness. I think your point on data and evidence generation resonates. Ilona, maybe let me kind of ask you from the regulatory lens perspective, right? As you think about kind of the gap shortcomings, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges, and what steps can we start to take from that lens to put this ecosystem in place?
Yeah. I think to get the optimal system, we need to look at the big picture. And that means we all need to talk together, I completely agree. And it also means we have to acknowledge others' needs, and we need to come to a compromise. And anybody who thinks that pushing their desire through in an isolated area is not going to solve the big picture. We need to look at various aspects, and we need to build an understanding beyond our own expertise. An area where I'm particularly active are interfaces, and again, those interfaces per se are not unique to ATMPs, but they hit the ATMPs in some. So whether it's the interface IVDR, the interface MDR, the interface GMO, the interface substance of human origin, clinical trials, when you're developing an ATMP, it's like the masterclass in regulatory knowledge. Not just from the developer's side, but also from the regulator's side. And I completely agree on the need for training, but if you think about it, what does that mean? It means that the few people who have the expert knowledge get all the pressure, because they are the ones that need to train internally, the new assessors. They are supposed to be the ones that reach out, train other people. They are supposed to be the ones developing guidelines, and they're supposed to be the ones knowledgeable on the interface. That's a very high call, particularly when the salaries in industry are multifold higher. And I can see a lot of colleagues, and that's also a natural thing, moving from regulation to industry, and therefore, the pressure, I can say, has increased a lot on the people remaining behind. But I completely agree that knowledge and training is the ultimate thing, and I also find it slightly regretful that there hasn't been more outrage from the policymakers to the CAT, which was established for the purpose of providing background expertise on the facts, obviously not on the decisions on policy, but on the facts and factual background that form the basis of the policy, or should form the basis of the policy. So I think that's what I'm trying to improve as a CAT chair to the extent that I can. But it's definitely not easy. And those kinds of activities take a tremendous effort, because if you think about it, even just in terms of a training for regulators, a frontal lecture is not going to do it. You actually have to prepare a case study that is sufficiently small to be able to put it in a one-day training, have them read the dossier, then go through it, don't present them with the solutions, but have them come up with their own thoughts and then reflect on those thoughts. So those are tremendously work-intensive activities that obviously don't generate any fees, which the agencies are dependent upon. So talking about the big picture, that's all part of it.
Yeah, so you're talking about the big picture, you're talking about kind of the interfaces, but I think equally important with that is also going to be a prioritization and decision-making. And I know that's something we've talked about a little bit. Maybe something you can elaborate further out there as to how do we think about prioritizing here? Because there's a lot that needs to happen. And do we collectively across these interfaces understand kind of what are the 3 or 4 big issues?
Yes, I think, one of the challenges at the interfaces is it's discussion amongst equal partners. And eventually you reach a point where it has to be made clear, and that needs to come from the policymakers, who has the trump card. Because fundamentally, all legislations in Europe, considering health, want the same thing. They want safety for the patient, they want robustness of data, they want transparency. But it has been translated in slightly different practical requirements. So fundamentally, we are agreed. But then, procedurally, administratively, they diverge. So at some point, policy has to say, okay, as long as those big criteria are sufficiently fulfilled, we are going to follow one or the other. Because as assessors, and I really want industry to understand that, because as assessors, we are the prime target. The assessors need to improve the system. Well, we need to work within the legislations. And if you are tasked with obeying the legislation, you can't just say, well, for the sake of this applicant, I'm going to ignore what the legislation wants from me. So the first step needs to be to improve the legislation, and then the assessors can apply that. And therefore, I think it's very critical when there are issues to identify who can solve them. And most of the time, unless it's a scientific issue, it is not the assessors.
Point. Marcello, Jim, anything you would like to add there?
Excuse me. I think a couple of things maybe on the theme of education. I think there's a lot that needs to be done in companies as well. I think perhaps you might think companies have endless resources and they tackle education or training gaps very quickly, but the reality is that we are hit by a new legislation as hard as any other stakeholders, that it takes time to create the internal experts, and this is particularly true at the level of some of the most challenging themes, like the interface between the CTR or the IVDR and the IVDR, for example. So it takes time. Something that Ilona mentioned that I really like to see is sharing of case studies, sharing of precedents. I was lucky enough to be in a company that still has a regulatory research group that does research into regulatory precedents. It's a great asset to have to learn from experiences of others. And I would commend the agency and the agencies whenever they publish their experience with new regulatory processes. I think there was a recent publication, for example, on the regulatory experience on genome editing. I think I've seen that coming through in recent days.
We're trying.
So that's great to see. I also think, on top of education, we have to become better in Europe at writing legislation. And I know it's difficult. I know, we all try to do our best, but we really need to strike the right balance, right, between flexibility and predictability, between incentives and responsibility, between tackling the present challenges, but also making legislation future-proof. So those are, such critical aspects that we need to get better of, because Europe is great for dialogue. And it's great when it comes to resolving the implementation issues. But we spend such a huge amount of time and resources trying to tackle those issues at the interfaces in particular, that it makes you think, oh, could we do better at the onset in the process?
Yeah, and I think to take up on that, so I'm a big fan of the European regulators, I must say. I think we're doing a great job at that. And what I would like to see is that everybody can kind of agree on where is actually the bar. So it should be easy to make things, right from the beginning. That's, I think, everybody would benefit a lot of that. So I think it's something, even talking of training, at some point you're realizing that you're actually talking about, different things. So that's something I would like to see, a good streamlining of and more clear regulation. How is the most simple and efficient way to do this right, so that the evaluators in the end of the day can do their job much more efficiently?
Yeah, I think we talked about that before. And at some point you have to switch from being a scientist to being a product developer. And just because you're a scientist is not an excuse to ignore the requirements. But one of the aspects that I see also in the current discussions, and I see it as a big risk, is the trivialization of ATMPs. They are not well-established, well-characterized products at this point. There is a lot of knowledge we don't have. And no, just because you're a physician, it's not your God-given right to manufacture your gene therapy whenever you want. But technologically, it's possible. And I think that is why we're having a lot of the issues. And not everything that is scientifically feasible is going to translate into a successful product. And also, just because it's an ATMP doesn't mean it needs to result in a marketing authorization, because there are lots of other considerations. And I think any approach that is black and white is going to be incorrect, because it's not a black and white field.
I agree. Thank you. Let me come to you, Barbara, kind of, bringing back the patient lens, right? So again, I think, Jim talked a little bit about the initiatives that are happening in the Nordic, similarly from your lens with UNIAMO, and has your community developed any initiatives, proposals within regional/national level? How are you starting to kind of shape some of this narrative that you said, right, around evidence and education? Could you speak a little bit to some of the work your organization is doing?
Yes, sure. So as UNIAMO, we have promoted a few training sessions for for the members of our Senate, for our politicians. Very basic, to share with them very basic knowledge about ATMPs, and we realized actually they didn't know very much about ATMPs. And so this initiative was very useful, because as a consequence, a couple of members of the Senate developed a proposal. So currently there is a proposal in our country to establish a specific fund for ATMPs in our budget law, which should be it's completely different from the past. So the idea is that there is a fund to support the development and the delivery of ATMPs. And these funds should be fueled every year by certain amount, which represent, let's say, the cost savings for the government. So it's calculated as every savings, every amount that our government will not spend to wrongly cure patients because of the ATMPs. So the idea is to have these funds as a long-term investment, year by year, not just to consider a single cash expenses for 1 year budget law. So this is, I mean, we are very happy that there is this kind of proposal, and of course we are supporting this proposal, we are advocating for this. We will not know, I mean, if it will be approved or not until the end of this year, but we are advocating for this. And at the same time, we are also supporting proposal at a European level, because our European Federation, Eurodis, issued a proposal to establish a European fund to support the development of ATMPs for ultra-rare diseases. Secondly, there is another proposal that we have been doing to our government. So probably know that in Italy we have a double level assessment. So we have a national assessment by the IFA, but also regional assessment. We have 20 different regions. So this means that the reimbursement price may change in every single region, and also the time to access the therapy may change. So the system is completely unequal. So our proposal is to change this and to have only one national assessment. And in the meantime, while we have two levels, at least we have proposed to the regions to have a kind of horizon scanning, so to prepare themselves in advance in order to reduce the time. We don't want patients wait too much. So if a therapy is approved, it should be, possible to deliver the therapy to patients as soon as possible. This is the idea. And lastly, my last thing, it's about the infrastructure. So our proposal is about changing a little bit something in the identification of the reference centers, because from 2 points of view. So from one side, we ask that the reference centers to deliver ATMPs are chosen not only using political criteria, but using mostly clinical, scientific criteria. And secondly, in Italy, we have the majority of ATMP centers are located in the north, in the northern part of Italy. This means that a lot of people need to travel. So from one end, we asked that all the travel and accommodation costs for patients should be included in the reimbursement price. And also, our proposal is to create a kind of network of delivering centers that is more equally distributed all over Italy. And it is, let's say, transversal to the different therapeutic areas. So, and also it's that collaborates with the European Reference Network at Italian level. So these three are the main proposal that we issued at the national level.
Thank you, Barbara, for sharing. Jim, I want to kind of ask you very similar, right? With the initiative that you've now set up with CCRM Nordic, what does good look like, right? So you're starting to take the first steps in moving there. If you kind of fast forward and imagine yourself sitting here in this room 2 years from now, what does good look like for you?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, I think. So obviously there's a lot of challenges, but I think that you can see that there are actually now popping up quite a lot of successful small developers. And I think that's interesting with this field, that you can actually see that small and medium-sized companies are actually even able to go all the way to market authorization, and quite quickly, sometimes. So it's a very interesting development. But what I hope for, if we look at our local ecosystem, and then we look out towards Europe, we're actually seeing that there's a lot of similar problems everywhere, every country has the same issues. There are, however, some different ideas on how to solve those problems. So I hope that on the European level, there could be some kind of agreement on how should we do things best. But so for us, and our mission in enabling companies to go into first in man and to help them commercialize and raise money, what we hope for is for them to be able to sit back here in Europe and do their development from here, so they can scale and do clinical trials here, and that we could be play our part in the kind of growing of the whole ecosystem. And that we also should work closely with patient organizations already, from the earliest kind of development, because I think that's the challenge. This is a very complicated innovation system and ecosystem, and therefore I think we hope to be kind of the middleman there to actually be able to work with all stakeholders as a not-for-profit. But in the end of the day also, I think it's very important to work with the technology developers. There's been a lot of talk of reducing the cost of goods. And there I think that the industry, both big pharma and the technology developers, has a very important role to play. In the end of the day, I think when we see more and more marketable products now, I think there's going to be much more competition, and then I guess hopefully price could be one of the competitive edges of some of the, for instance, hundreds of CAR T products under development. So I hope that we can kind of play a part in that. Yeah.
Thank you. So I know we're coming up close to the time, and I'd love to see if the audience has any questions. So maybe if you have a question, please think about it. But I did want to ask one question, Ilona. And obviously, COVID completely kind of transformed, upended the way we work, and it's but natural sometimes to always ask, are there any learnings from the COVID experience, right, where we kind of went through this very accelerated journey? Obviously, that's a very kind of broad statement, and I'd love to get your take, maybe, Ilona, and others, if they want to jump in to see any learnings we can bring from there.
I'm going to answer the same thing I wrote to you in the email. Working like that is not sustainable for regulatory agencies. We were all buying into the situation. Everybody was doing their best, industry as well as assessors. The hope that after the pandemic things would quiet down and colleagues could go back to normal working hours and the normal work has not materialized. And so I have to say that there is a certain level of burnout between colleagues, and we definitely feel that. So, and I think particularly for the ATMPs, any kind of idea of rolling submission is problematic from my perspective, because for the ATMPs, more than for any other type of product, you need to look at, again, the big picture. So quality, preclinical, and clinical, because there are going to be uncertainties, maybe in the quality, maybe you can address it in preclinical, maybe you can address clinical uncertainties by preclinical and quality. So you need to have all the information at the same time to have that crossover. And you need an efficient way of working, because already the ATMPs are more complicated to review, and it takes longer to review them. And and it's also complicated for applicants to keep the consistency within their dossier. So I'm very worried that once you have a situation where bits and pieces are submitted at different times, that the overall consistency is going to get lost. And I see that so I don't see the COVID type submission and review system as reasonable for ATMPs.
Any questions from the audience?
Thank you. I'm Stefano Benvenuti from Fondazione Telethon. Just one question that we're struggling with is the cost, really the cost of the fee from regulatory agencies related with the products, because those fees are based on the effort by the regulators to evaluate the dossier, which is understandable, but ends up not being so fair when you have products that are for very small population. That means the cost of the fee of the regulatory agency for each patient you treat tends to be very high, while could be negligible for other indications. So it's true that the effort of evaluating a dossier is probably the same no matter how frequent the disease is, but the impact on the price and ultimately on access is quite different. And we know in ATMPs, CMC variations, all those kind of stuff happens quite often because the production is very complex, product is very complex. So, the attached fee for every variation tends to be accumulate easily to a good amount that is split among few patients in many cases for rare disease. So I was wondering whether that's an issue that we could tackle from a different angle, maybe, try to introduce a bit of proportionality between incomes generated or frequency of prevalence of the pathology. And
I understand the issue, but again, this for me is clearly a policy issue, because I, for example, come from an agency that is funded based on fees. So if the agencies don't get the equivalent of what they put in, there is a deficit. And actually, for the Austrian agency, it would be illegal to work like that. So the question is always who pays. But it cannot be that the agencies are turning into funding agencies because they are not getting the fees that they need to survive. I clearly understand what the problem is. I just don't think that the agencies doing the review are where this needs to be sorted.
By the way, wait until the new fee regulation, EMA fee regulation, I should say, kicks in. There are impressive hikes in some of the fees, so I do think there needs to be a mechanism whereby, the smaller companies or not-for-profit organizations or companies working in, very small niche area to get some, discounts or reductions or incentives. And I think there are some of them already, but still, it's going up dramatically, even for a medium-sized company like mine. I think we were really shocked by, we're really getting close to the US level of fees, at least for DMA. So I think what you say is even more stringent from 1st of Jan 2025.
So we're coming close to the end of our session. Maybe what I'd love for us to do is go around and maybe, in 30 seconds or so, maybe tell me what's kind of your one expectation or hope, right? We see that there's a path to kind of really building the ATMP ecosystem. The right steps are being taken, and I'd love for kind of maybe a closing statement from each one of you to kind of, summarize your remarks. Maybe Barbara?
It's difficult. So I think we have to remember that we are discussing about this because in the end, we want to cure people. We want to cure people with rare diseases. So we must find solutions, technical solutions, practical solutions, who allow rare disease patients to be cured. Otherwise, all this discussion will be unuseful. So we need to be very practical. In this, 1 hour experience, I've learned a lot. So one of my personal expectations was to better understand what are the needs and also the difficulties of all the stakeholders involved in the ecosystem. So I think that a concrete, practical way to proceed is to keep having multi-stakeholders dialogue and learning from each other in a very practical way. And it's very important also to know what are the difficulties at regulatory level, as well as manufacturing level. We need to talk to each other more frequently in a more systematic way.
Thank you.
And I think that yes, we have some challenges, but there's also great opportunities ahead, I think. And we've been working, visionally in Sweden. So I think all in the audience here, I guess it's late in the program, but I think I want everybody to ask themselves the question, first of all, do I sign up on the vision to make Europe a leader within this area? And I hope that everybody does. And then you can actually go home and can see what can be my role to have a positive development of the European ATMP ecosystem.
Thank you, Jim. Marcello and Ilona.
Yeah, and for me, I think it's really building on the strengths that Europe has, right? And we talked about the regulatory network, we talked about the constructive dialogue that we are having here and in so many other fora. I think we have to continue to build on those strengths, continue and maybe fill some of the cracks at the interface, different legislation. I think a new interface for me is with the HTA regulation. We haven't talked about that, but I think we can do it. So,
thank you, and Ilona.
Yeah, and I can provide the assurance that the regulators are doing their best to work on and improve the system and make the requirements transparent. But I think what we shouldn't forget, in the end, if you want a marketing authorization, you need solid data, and that is undisputable. You will not get a marketing authorization based on promises. You need to have the data.
Well, we are at the end of our session, so I just want to give a big round of applause to our panelists for taking the time. And I learned a lot during this 1 hour. I hope you guys did too, but I think over the last 2 days, I think we've all heard a lot around what it takes to build it, and hopefully, I feel very encouraged by the way we've closed the session to say, listen, we are in a good place, and we believe, I think we can get Europe on the right track to kind of becoming a leader back in innovation again. So thank you all, and with that, I think have a great rest of your time here in Rome, and enjoy.